I came home to find my power lines cut by the HOA, my house silent and powerless. I thought I was alone, until hours later their own lights failed and exposed the truth behind their hidden decisions. Welcome back, everyone. Before today's story begins, I want to thank each and every one of you for being here. If this is your first time on the channel, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you'll always know when a new story is released. Your support means more than you know. Every like, comment, and subscription helps this channel grow and allows us to keep sharing incredible stories with viewers around the world. And before we begin, tell me this, where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. Now, grab a comfortable seat, relax, and let's dive into today's unforgettable story. The silence inside my house was the first sign that something was wrong. The darkness came second. I still remember the exact moment I turned the front door handle that night. The house felt different. Not empty, not abandoned, just wrong. My name is Caleb Morrison, and for 15 years, Willow Creek Ridge had been the place I proudly called home. I knew every tree along the street, every neighbor who walked their dog in the morning, and every small sound my house made when the seasons changed. The refrigerator had its familiar hum. The heating system clicked before starting. The outdoor lights automatically turned on every evening at sunset. Those little things created a sense of comfort. Until one night, they all disappeared at once. I stepped inside after a long day and immediately noticed the silence. No refrigerator, no lights, no security system, nothing. At first, I assumed it was a neighborhood outage. Maybe a transformer issue. Maybe a storm-related problem. But when I looked through the window, I saw something that made my stomach tighten. The houses across the street still had power. The streetlights were still glowing. My home was the only one sitting in darkness. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and walked outside. The night air was cold and the damp grass soaked through my shoes as I moved toward the electrical panel near the side of my property. That was when I smelled it. Burned plastic. A sharp chemical smell that didn't belong there. I opened the flashlight beam toward the service box and stopped. The panel door was open. The lock was damaged, and the electrical connection leading to my house had been disturbed. I didn't need years of experience working around mechanical and electrical systems to know something was wrong. But fortunately, I had those years. I knew what normal wear looked like. I knew what equipment failure looked like. This wasn't either. Someone had opened that panel. Someone had changed something. I crouched down and looked closer. There were fresh tool marks around the screws. Small pieces of insulation were scattered on the ground. Near the edge of the work area was a piece of bright blue marking tape. I recognized it immediately. Willow Creek Ridge HOA contractors had been using that same tape around their recent infrastructure project. My mind went back to a conversation I had with Rebecca Thornton just days earlier. She had stood at my property line with a clipboard in her hand and a confident smile on her face. She told me the HOA was making necessary improvements around the community. I asked a simple question. Does the HOA have permission to make changes that affect my private property? She didn't answer directly. Instead, she told me everyone needed to support the community's decisions. That sentence bothered me, because support and permission are not the same thing. Now, standing beside my damaged electrical box, I understood why she avoided answering. I didn't call Rebecca that night. I didn't drive to the HOA office. Anger would not help me. Accusations would not prove anything. So I did the one thing I trusted. I documented everything. I photographed the open panel, the damaged connection, the tool marks, the surrounding area, every small detail. Because I knew whoever did this believed the darkness would make me powerless. They believed I would complain, get frustrated, and eventually walk away. But they made one mistake. They underestimated how carefully I pay attention. When I returned inside, I placed the photos on my kitchen table. The same table where I planned repairs and paid bills was now covered with evidence. And as I looked through every image, I noticed something important. This wasn't random damage. This was a decision. Someone had touched my property because they believed they had the authority to do it. And by the time the sun came up the next morning, I wasn't just trying to restore power to my house anymore. I was trying to find out who believed they had the right to take it away. The letter on my porch was the first attack. The missing power was only the beginning. I woke up the next morning expecting answers. Instead, I found a warning. A white envelope was sitting perfectly centered on my front steps, untouched by the morning rain. There was no name written on the outside because it didn't need one. I already knew where it came from. Willow Creek Ridge HOA. I picked it up and walked inside, carrying it past the darkened rooms of my house. The temporary power source running nearby provided only a small amount of light, but it was enough to remind me of what had happened the night before. Someone had opened my electrical panel. Someone had disconnected my connection. And now someone wanted me to believe I was the problem. I opened the envelope at my kitchen table. Inside was an official notice from Rebecca Thornton, the HOA president. The wording was careful. Too careful. Unauthorized interference with community infrastructure. Violation of neighborhood procedures. Failure to coordinate with HOA management. I read the letter slowly. Not because I didn't understand the words. Because I couldn't believe how easily the situation had been reversed. The person who lost power was being accused of causing trouble. The homeowner whose equipment had been changed without permission was being told he had failed to cooperate. That was when I understood Rebecca's strategy. She wasn't trying to fix the situation. She was trying to define it before anyone looked deeper. I placed the letter beside the photographs from the night before. The damaged panel. The loose connection. The tool marks. The blue marking tape. Every image told a different story than the one Rebecca was trying to create. So I decided to follow the facts. My first stop was the county records office. The building was quiet, filled with the smell of old paper and worn wooden cabinets. People walked through the halls searching for information about property lines, permits, and records that most homeowners never think about. But I wasn't looking for information. I was looking for proof. I requested documents related to utility access, infrastructure projects, and property boundaries around Willow Creek Ridge. After waiting several minutes, the clerk returned with a stack of files. At first glance, they looked ordinary. But ordinary documents often reveal extraordinary mistakes. I carefully reviewed every page. Then I found something. A utility responsibility agreement from years earlier. The document clearly explained that the electrical connection serving my home was considered private property. The HOA had responsibility for shared areas, not my personal service line. I leaned back in the chair and looked at the page again. The question was no longer whether Rebecca had crossed a boundary. She had. The question was why she believed nobody would notice. I continued searching and discovered a maintenance request filed just days before my power was disconnected. The description seemed harmless. Community infrastructure adjustment near homeowner boundary. But the approval section caught my attention. There was no utility company authorization. No official repair notice. No homeowner agreement. Only an HOA approval form. And at the bottom was Rebecca Thornton's signature. I sat quietly for a moment. Because that signature changed everything. The damaged wires were no longer just an incident. They were part of a decision. That evening, I returned home and placed every document on my kitchen table. The same table where I had placed my first photographs. But the feeling was different now. The darkness inside my house didn't feel like helplessness anymore. It felt like evidence. The missing power had given me a question. The records had given me a direction. And Rebecca had given me something she never intended to provide. A trail. She thought turning off my electricity would make me feel powerless. Instead, she gave me the reason to look closer. And the closer I looked, the more I realized one thing. The person who changed my power line had left behind a paper trail strong enough to expose everything. The HOA meeting wasn't designed to find the truth. It was designed to make sure nobody asked the right questions. I realized that the moment I walked through the doors. 3 days after my power was disconnected, Willow Creek Ridge held an emergency community meeting. Rebecca Thornton called it a discussion, but I knew better. It was a performance. The clubhouse was already crowded when I arrived. Neighbors stood in small groups, whispering about what happened. Some looked concerned. Others looked uncomfortable, like they knew something was wrong but weren't sure if they should say it. That was how HOA power usually worked. Not through force. Through silence. Rebecca stood near the front of the room with a folder in her hands. She looked calm. Prepared. Almost too prepared. The same confidence she carried when she came to my property days earlier. When the meeting started, she spoke first. She talked about protecting Willow Creek Ridge. She talked about maintaining standards. She talked about how difficult it was to manage a community when certain homeowners refused to cooperate. Then she looked directly at me. Mr. Morrison has created confusion regarding a routine infrastructure matter. Routine. That word bothered me. Because there was nothing routine about coming home to a dark house and finding someone had opened my electrical panel. But Rebecca wasn't talking about what happened. She was talking about how she wanted people to see what happened. I stood up and walked toward the front table. I didn't bring anger with me. I brought documents. The question isn't whether the HOA wants to improve the neighborhood, I said. The question is whether the HOA had the authority to affect private property without permission. The room became quiet. I placed the first document down. The utility responsibility agreement. Then the property records. Then the maintenance request. Each page created a small shift in the room. Neighbors who had been watching casually started paying attention. Rebecca immediately tried to explain. She said the HOA was acting in the best interest of everyone. She said the project was necessary. She said nobody intended for my power to be interrupted. But intention wasn't the issue. Authority was. I placed the final document on the table. The approval form. The one with Rebecca Thornton's signature. For the first time, I saw her expression change. Not panic. Not fear. Just hesitation. A neighbor picked up the paper and looked at the signature. Did you approve this modification? Rebecca answered quickly. She said she approved the project, not the specific changes. But that answer created another question. How could someone approve a project without understanding what was being changed? How could the person responsible for protecting the community allow work to affect a homeowner's property without proper review? The room slowly changed. People started asking questions. Not angry questions. Important questions. Questions about previous projects. Questions about contractor decisions. Questions about why certain information was never shared. Rebecca had entered the meeting believing she controlled the conversation. But conversations change when people have evidence. Afterward, several neighbors stayed behind. They asked to see copies of the documents. Some admitted they had experienced similar situations, but never thought they had enough information to challenge the HOA. Driving home that evening, I thought about the first night. The darkness. The silence. The damaged electrical panel. At that moment, I thought someone had taken away my power. But standing in that meeting room, I realized something. The power was never only in the wires. It was in the ability to question what happened. Rebecca believed the HOA's authority came from the position she held. But she forgot something important. Authority only survives when people trust the person using it. And trust disappears quickly when the truth starts appearing on the table. She thought cutting my power would make me feel isolated. Instead, she gave me the reason to look closer. And the more I looked, the more I discovered. Because every decision leaves a mark. And Rebecca had left more than she realized. The contractor didn't look surprised when I showed him the document. He looked concerned. And that was when I knew the missing piece of the story was finally starting to appear. After the HOA meeting, I understood something important. The documents I had were enough to prove something was wrong. But they didn't explain how it happened. I knew Rebecca Thornton approved something she shouldn't have. I knew my private electrical connection was affected. But I still needed to understand who physically made the changes and what instructions they were given. So I followed the trail back to the company listed on the maintenance request. Willow Creek Electrical Services operated from a small industrial building outside town. It wasn't the kind of place most homeowners ever visited. There were trucks parked outside, equipment stacked along the walls, and the constant sound of tools working in the background. The smell inside reminded me of my old job. Metal, dust, electrical components. A place where every mistake could have consequences. The manager introduced himself as Daniel Pierce. I explained why I was there and placed the HOA maintenance request on his desk. At first, he simply read it. Then his expression changed. He looked at the document again. Then he looked at me. "You're the homeowner from Willow Creek Ridge?" I nodded. He slowly picked up the paper. This wasn't the original request. Those words immediately caught my attention. "What do you mean?" Daniel walked to a filing cabinet and returned with another folder. Inside was the original project plan. The first version was simple. The HOA wanted improvements to shared infrastructure near the community entrance. Nothing involving my home. Nothing involving my private electrical service. Then he placed another document beside it. A revised version. At first glance, the changes looked small. A few lines. A few adjustments. A few words added to expand the project area. But those small changes moved the work closer to my property. Close enough to affect the electrical connection that powered my house. I stared at the two documents side by side. The difference was almost invisible. And that was exactly why it worked. Someone had changed the plan without making it obvious. Daniel explained that his company received the updated instructions from the HOA before the work began. They believed the HOA had the authority to approve those changes. They weren't trying to damage my property. They were following the information they were given. That detail mattered, because it meant the contractor wasn't the person I needed to confront. The real question was who changed the instructions. Before I left, Daniel gave me copies of the original plan, the revised version, and the communication records connected to the project. I placed them carefully inside my folder. Not because I wanted revenge, because I wanted the truth. That evening, I returned home and spread everything across my kitchen table. The photographs from the first night, the HOA notice, the property records, the contractor documents. For the first time, the entire situation started forming a clear picture. The damaged panel wasn't the beginning. It was the result. The real story started earlier. With a decision. With a modification. With someone believing a small change would never be noticed. The next morning, I contacted an independent electrical inspector. I didn't want someone connected to the HOA. I didn't want someone connected to the contractor. I wanted someone who only cared about what the system showed. The inspection took several hours. I watched as the inspector checked the connections, reviewed the equipment, and compared the current setup with the approved plans. When he finally finished, he handed me his report. The conclusion was clear. The modifications affecting my property were outside the approved scope of work. They were not properly authorized. I read those words carefully, because for weeks, I had been trying to prove that something felt wrong. Now I had something stronger than a feeling. I had confirmation. Rebecca thought the darkness would make me stop asking questions. She thought the confusion would protect her decisions. But every document led somewhere. Every change had a reason, and every signature had a story behind it. The power line was only the visible damage. The real problem was the decision that caused it. And now I finally knew where to look next. The first house that went dark after mine wasn't a coincidence. It was the moment everyone in Willow Creek Ridge finally realized the problem was bigger than one homeowner. I remember standing in my driveway that afternoon, looking at the repaired connection beside my house, when my phone started filling with messages. At first, I thought they were asking about my situation. Then I read the first one. "Caleb, is your power back? Because ours just went out." I stared at the screen. Then another message appeared. "My lights are flickering." Then another. "Something is wrong with the neighborhood system." For a few seconds, I didn't move, because I understood something before anyone else did. The same changes that affected my home were now spreading through Willow Creek Ridge. I walked outside and looked down the street. One house was dark. Then another. Then another. The neighborhood that always looked perfectly maintained under Rebecca Thornton's leadership suddenly looked completely different. People were standing outside with flashlights. Neighbors who had never spoken to each other about HOA decisions were now asking the same questions. What happened? Who approved this? Why didn't anyone know? And for the first time, Rebecca didn't have an easy answer. Within an hour, the HOA sent out an emergency notice. The message called it an unexpected technical issue, a temporary disruption, a situation being handled. But those words felt familiar, because they sounded exactly like every explanation Rebecca had given before. Carefully chosen, professionally written, designed to make people stop asking questions. But this time, people weren't stopping. The next morning, I contacted Daniel Pierce from Willow Creek Electrical Services again. I wanted an independent answer, not an HOA explanation, not a carefully prepared statement. The truth. When Daniel arrived, he inspected the shared infrastructure near the community area while comparing the current system with the documents he had provided earlier. I watched him work quietly, checking connections, reviewing diagrams, taking notes. After several hours, he called me over. His expression was serious. "The changes made during that project affected more than your property," he said. I looked at him. "What does that mean?" He pointed toward the system records. The revised instructions expanded the work beyond the original plan. That created problems in areas connected to the neighborhood system. I looked back toward the houses. The same project Rebecca described as an improvement had created instability throughout the community. That was the moment everything changed. Because this was no longer a disagreement between me and the HOA. This was a problem that affected everyone. That evening, Rebecca held another emergency meeting. But it felt nothing like the first one. Before, she stood at the front of the room controlling the conversation. Now, residents entered with documents in their hands and questions ready. One neighbor asked why the project scope changed. Another asked why homeowners were never informed. Someone else asked who approved the revised instructions. Rebecca tried to maintain her composure. She repeated that the HOA acted responsibly. She said nobody expected this outcome. But the room had changed. People were no longer listening for explanations. They were looking for accountability. I placed the contractor documents on the table, then the inspection report, then the original plan compared with the revised version. The difference was impossible to ignore. The room became silent. Not because nobody had questions, because everyone finally understood the answer. Rebecca thought the power she controlled came from her position. But she made one mistake. She forgot that information changes everything. The moment people saw the documents, they stopped seeing this as a technical failure. They saw a pattern, a decision, a choice that affected real people. Driving home that night, I looked at the neighborhood lights slowly coming back on. Months earlier, darkness made me feel powerless. Now, darkness had revealed the truth. Rebecca tried to disconnect my home from the system around me. Instead, she exposed the system she was supposed to protect. And for the first time since this began, I knew the entire community was finally looking in the same direction. The lawyer looked at the documents for 5 minutes before saying something I already suspected. "Caleb, this was never just a mistake." That sentence changed everything. I had spent weeks trying to understand how a simple infrastructure project turned into my house losing power. At first, I thought I was dealing with one bad decision. Then I found the revised plans. Then the contractor records. Then the inspection report. Now, sitting across from Michael Reeves, an attorney who specialized in property disputes and community association conflicts, I realized the problem was much deeper. Rebecca Thornton didn't just make an error. She created a chain of decisions that depended on nobody looking closely. Michael spread the documents across his desk. The original project plan, the revised instructions, the HOA approval form, the contractor communication records, the electrical inspection, each piece connected to the next. "This is important," Michael said, pointing at the revised document. The original plan stayed within community property boundaries. The change expanded the project into an area affecting your private service. I nodded. That was the part one kept coming back to. The change was small, almost invisible. A few lines on a page. A few words added to a document. But those small changes created a completely different outcome. My home lost power. The neighborhood system became unstable. And nobody from the HOA informed the homeowners who were affected. Michael explained that the strongest cases are not built on emotion. They are built on timelines. So we created one. The original proposal. The date Rebecca approved the revision. The day the contractor performed the work. The night my power went out. The community outage that followed. Every event had a place. Every decision had a connection. And every connection led back to the same person. Rebecca Thornton. A few days later, Michael sent a formal request to the HOA demanding all records related to the project. I knew Rebecca would not welcome that. And I was right. Her response came quickly. Another community message. Another carefully written explanation. This time, she stopped calling it a technical issue. She called it a misunderstanding. She claimed the HOA acted responsibly. She claimed the project was approved properly. She claimed certain homeowners were creating unnecessary conflict. I read the message sitting at my kitchen table. The same table where this entire investigation started. The difference was that now I wasn't looking at questions. I was looking at answers. Rebecca was still trying to control the story, but she was no longer the only person with information. The following week, the independent review officially began. The inspector examined the electrical work throughout the affected areas of Willow Creek Ridge. I watched quietly as he compared the physical system with the approved plans. The difference was clear. The work completed did not match the original authorization. The modifications went beyond what homeowners were told. When the inspector finished, he handed Michael the final report. The conclusion was direct. The changes affecting my property and the community system were not properly approved through the correct process. I remember holding that report in my hands. For weeks, I had been trying to explain something that I knew was wrong. Now, someone completely independent had confirmed it. That feeling wasn't anger. It was relief. Because facts don't need to raise their voice. They don't need to threaten anyone. They simply exist. That evening, I organized the evidence one more time. The photographs from the night my power disappeared. The HOA notice accusing me. The contractor records. The inspection report. Everything that started as scattered pieces had become a complete story. Rebecca believed her authority came from being the person who signed the documents. But she forgot something. A signature does not erase responsibility. It creates it. And now, that responsibility was leading directly back to her. The next step wasn't about proving something happened. That part was already clear. The next step was making sure nobody could ignore it anymore. The courtroom was the first place where Rebecca Thornton couldn't control the room. For months, she controlled meetings. She controlled announcements. She controlled the version of events that people heard. But that changed the moment the evidence was placed in front of someone who didn't care about titles. Only facts. The hearing took place on a cold Tuesday morning at the county building. I arrived early with Michael Reeves, carrying the same folder that started as a collection of confusing details and had now become a complete timeline. Inside were the photographs from the night my power disappeared, the HOA notices, the original project plans, the revised instructions, the contractor statements, the independent inspection report. Every piece had a purpose. Every piece told part of the story. Across the room, Rebecca sat with the HOA's attorney. She looked different from the woman I had seen at community meetings. There was no confident smile, no carefully prepared speech, no crowd waiting for her explanation. Just documents and questions. When the hearing began, the HOA presented their argument first. They said the project was intended to improve Willow Creek Ridge. They said the electrical issues were unexpected. They said nobody intentionally caused harm. The words sounded familiar. They were the same explanations Rebecca had repeated from the beginning. But there was something different now. Nobody was accepting them without proof. When it was our turn, Michael didn't start with accusations. He started with the timeline. He showed the original plan, a project designed to improve shared community infrastructure. Then he showed the revised instructions, the small modification that expanded the work toward my private electrical service. The room became quiet, because everyone could see the difference. The change wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a decision. Michael continued. He explained that the contractor followed instructions provided by the HOA. He explained that the work performed did not match the original approved scope. He explained that my property was affected because someone expanded the project without proper authorization. Then he placed the inspection report on the table. The independent findings confirmed what I had been saying for weeks. The modifications were not properly approved. The process had failed. And the responsibility did not disappear just because nobody expected the consequences. The judge looked through the documents carefully. Then came the question everyone in the room was waiting for. Who authorized these changes? For a moment, the room was completely silent. Rebecca adjusted the papers in front of her. She explained that she trusted the project team. She explained that she believed the changes were necessary. She explained that her intention was always to protect the community. But intentions were not the issue anymore. Responsibility was. A signature means something. An approval means something. A decision that affects someone's property cannot simply disappear when the result becomes inconvenient. By the end of the hearing, the conclusion was clear. The HOA had exceeded its authority by approving work that affected private property without proper authorization. They were required to correct the violations, restore proper procedures, and ensure future projects followed the correct process. Walking out of the building, I expected to feel satisfaction. Instead, I felt something else. Relief. Because the entire fight was never about proving I was right. It was about making sure the truth had a place to stand. Later that afternoon, I drove through Willow Creek Ridge. The neighborhood looked the same. The houses, the streets, the trees. But something had changed. People were paying attention now. Neighbors who once stayed quiet were asking questions. Residents who once ignored HOA decisions were requesting records. The fear of challenging authority was gone. And that was the moment I understood something important. Rebecca didn't lose because I had more power than she did. She lost because the truth had more weight than her position. She tried to control the system, but she forgot the system was built for the people living inside it. And once those people started looking closer, there was nothing left for her to hide behind. The most surprising thing wasn't that the HOA changed after the hearing. It was realizing how many things had been hidden before anyone thought to look. After the decision, I expected the hardest part to be over. The legal process was finished. The violations were documented. The repairs were moving forward. But I quickly discovered something important. A broken system doesn't change just because one person wins a case. It changes when people finally decide they deserve better. For years, Willow Creek Ridge operated under the assumption that questioning the HOA created problems. Residents attended meetings. They listened to announcements. They accepted decisions. Not because everyone agreed, because many people believed nothing would happen if they disagreed. That changed after the power incident. The night my house went dark forced everyone to see something they had ignored for too long. Small decisions can create big consequences. A few weeks after the hearing, the HOA held another community meeting. This time, the atmosphere was completely different. The room was full before the meeting even started. Neighbors who normally sat quietly were discussing documents. People brought copies of previous notices. Residents who had never spoken during meetings were now asking questions. And for the first time, Rebecca Thornton wasn't the person controlling the conversation. She stood near the front of the room, but the confidence she once carried was different. The community had changed. One resident asked why certain maintenance projects were approved without detailed explanations. Another asked how contractor decisions were reviewed. Someone else requested access to previous project records. These were not angry accusations. They were reasonable questions. The kind of questions that should have been asked from the beginning. Rebecca tried to explain that the HOA always acted in the community's best interest. But that phrase no longer had the same effect. Because people had learned something. Good intentions do not replace transparency. A few days later, the HOA announced new procedures for future infrastructure projects. Major changes would require clearer documentation. Homeowners affected by projects would receive proper notice. Contractor decisions would face additional review. The system that once allowed small changes to happen quietly was being forced into the light. I remember walking through Willow Creek Ridge one evening after those changes were announced. The neighborhood looked peaceful. The same streets, the same houses, the same lights glowing through the windows. But the feeling was different. People were paying attention. And that was the real difference. The power outage had started as a problem at my house, but it revealed a problem throughout the community. For years, many residents believed authority meant the ability to make decisions without being questioned. Now they understood something different. Authority only works when it is connected to responsibility. I stopped near the electrical box where everything began. The area had been repaired completely. The damaged components were gone. The warning signs were gone. To anyone passing by, it looked like an ordinary piece of equipment. But I knew what happened there. I remembered the first night. The darkness. The silence. The moment I realized someone had changed something that affected my home. At the time, I thought losing power was the worst part. I was wrong. The worst part was believing nobody would listen. And the best part was discovering that people would. Rebecca thought her position gave her control over the community. She believed paperwork and authority would be enough to end the conversation. But she forgot the most important thing about a neighborhood. It isn't built by one person. It is built by everyone living inside it. The wires were repaired. The system was corrected. But the biggest restoration wasn't electrical. It was trust. And once that trust returned, nobody was willing to go back into the dark again. The night my lights came back on, I realized something. The real victory was never about electricity. It was about making sure nobody could take away someone's power without being questioned. I still remember standing in my driveway that evening, watching the warm glow from my windows spill onto the yard. For weeks, that light had represented something I lost. Security, comfort, control. But now it represented something completely different. A reminder that a single homeowner could challenge a system that believed it was untouchable. When this started, I thought I was fighting to reconnect a wire. I thought the goal was simple. Repair the damage. Find out who caused it. Move on. But the deeper I looked, the more I realized the damaged power line was only the visible part of a much larger problem. The real issue was what happened when people stopped asking questions. Rebecca Thornton believed her position gave her authority. She believed being the HOA president meant decisions could move forward because she approved them. But leadership is not about having the ability to make decisions. It is about having the responsibility to make the right ones. After everything was resolved, Willow Creek Ridge became a different community. Not perfect. No community ever is. But people became involved. They attended meetings. They reviewed documents. They asked about projects before they happened instead of waiting until something went wrong. The silence that once protected bad decisions disappeared. And that was the biggest change. Not the legal decision, not the repairs, not even seeing Rebecca forced to answer difficult questions. The biggest change was watching ordinary homeowners realize they had a voice. A few months later, I walked past the same electrical box where this entire story began. The ground had been repaired. The equipment had been replaced. Everything looked normal again. Someone walking by would never know that place had once been the center of a community conflict. But I remembered every detail. The smell of burned plastic. The cold air that night. The flashlight beam moving across damaged equipment. The moment I realized someone had entered my property and changed something they had no right to touch. At the time, I felt powerless. But looking back, I understand something different now. The darkness didn't take away my power. It revealed where the real power was. It was in asking questions. It was in keeping records. It was in refusing to accept an explanation simply because someone in authority gave it. Rebecca tried to control the situation by controlling the information. But information has a way of finding the light. Every document, every signature, every decision. Eventually, everything connected. And once the truth became visible, nobody could pretend they didn't see it. I never wanted revenge against Rebecca Thornton. I never wanted her to lose everything. I only wanted accountability. I wanted my property respected. I wanted my neighbors informed. I wanted the rules to apply equally to everyone. And in the end, that was exactly what happened. The power lines were repaired. The community system was corrected. The HOA changed how it handled decisions. But the most important restoration was something you couldn't see. Trust. Because a neighborhood isn't protected by fences, rules, or titles. It is protected by people who are willing to speak when something isn't right. Rebecca thought she could control the flow of power into my home. What she never expected was that the truth would spread much further than electricity ever could. And every night when I turn on my lights, I remember the same thing. They tried to leave me in the dark. Instead, they helped an entire community see clearly.